We got Keith Idec of Boxing
There you
Scene
go.
on the line. Keith, how are you? Sorry to keep you holding there. I had no clue, even though the producer was trying to notify me.
Oh, no problem, Ness. How you guys doing?
Good, man. So I happened to hear your interview with Lance Pugmire and your feelings on Caleb Plant and Canelo Alvarez. So I don't really want you to go and reiterate everything, but do you still feel the same way? Are you any more confident that this will happen between Canelo and Plant?
Just based on some of the things I heard over the weekend, I kind of feel like they will make a deal here because it is the fight that Canelo wants, and he's going to have to give a little bit from his side to make it happen. And, I think if he really wants to fully unify these titles, which he obviously does, or he wouldn't have gone through with everything that's happened over the past, 8 months or so, I think he's going to give what he has to give to make the fight happen. I don't blame Caleb Plant at all for trying to squeeze as much money out of the biggest fight of his career that he can. So ultimately it's going to come down to Canelo probably taking a little less money than he wants to, but he's the one who put himself in this bargaining position in the sense that he said it's the only fight that he wants next. When you say that publicly, you're shifting leverage to the other side, and Caleb Plant and his people are just trying to take advantage of that situation, and you can't blame them for that from a business standpoint.
Let me ask you, with your years in this sport, do you think if Canelo decided to play hardball and said, okay, I'm going to just go and fight Bivol, I don't have to vacate any of these titles, or is there a mandatory that he can call and just give Plant more time to think, right? Because if Canelo announces a fight, what is Plant going to do?
Right. That's why I don't think it'll get to that point, guys, primarily because I don't think Canelo's going to want to have to go through these types of negotiations again. Bivol-Canelo is a good fight. I think Bivol would come down to 168. He has repeatedly said that he would do that. And it wouldn't cost Canelo any of his titles, as you mentioned, Ness. So it's a good fight, and I think people would want to see it. But I think from Canelo's standpoint, he wants to do this. He wants to become the fully unified super middleweight champion. And why push that down the line another 3 or 4 months when you're just going to be in the same position again? It's not like Caleb Plant and his people won't play hardball again. I think he might fight again in between. In some short, they can basically pick their opponent because Caleb Plant does not have a mandatory due. He satisfied his mandatory with his last fight against Caleb Truax. So he can kind of fight who he wants. And if we've learned anything from Caleb Plant's history here over the past few years, is if you give them the opportunity to make an optional defense, they're not going to take a tough fight. So they'll take a stay busy type of fight, and then he'll be in this position again. But ultimately, I just don't think Canelo Alvarez is going to want to do that.
Keith, now I spoke to Caleb at, I think it was Logan Paul. No, I don't know. Maybe it was Logan Paul. He was with Jordan, and he said 10 million was fair. Has he gone up from the 10? Because Billy got 8, and that's how I led my interview with him. Like, look, Billy got 8. People seem to think that 10 is fair because you're American and been doing great news on Fox. Eddie thought the 10 was okay. He thought that was fair because Caleb's American and been on Fox, and they gave 8 to Billy. Where did it become a negotiation war? Because you didn't give an exact number on your interview with Lance, but you did say that they're playing hardball, so they want more than 10 million.
I don't know the exact number. I mean, I'm not privy to the exact number that they're looking for. But in my interview with Chris Mannix, we were talking about, they're just trying to squeeze as much out of it as they can. But I was told over the weekend after I did Chris's podcast last week that this has now become more about what Canelo is willing to give up as opposed to what Caleb Plant wants. And fair is a relative term, obviously. And like I mentioned earlier, Ness, I think Canelo put himself, for an experienced fighter who's been through these types of negotiations many times before, he kind of put himself in a bad position by publicly stating that this is the only fight that he wants. Look, Caleb Plant has what Canelo Alvarez wants, and ultimately he's going to have to give that. Now, if it was some unreasonable number, let's just say it was 11 million or 12 million, because other opponents have made that to fight Canelo Alvarez. If that was what he was looking for, well, maybe it would become unreasonable at a certain standpoint because, this is going to be a pay-per-view fight in the United States, and, maybe they just can't pay him that much money because DAZN clearly overpaid overpaid for Daniel Jacobs, they overpaid for Sergey Kovalev, and that can't continue because those were just bad business moves, frankly, that they didn't receive a real good return on their investment in those fights, and that just can't continue happening.
Keith, where do you think this fight happens? Because if Caleb wants more money, does he want more money to go to DAZN, or is he being offered more money to stay on Fox and bring Canelo over?
I think the fight will be on Fox Sports pay-per-view. And remember, guys, even when Canelo's fights have been streamed by DAZN in the last couple of fights, they have been made available on Fox, or on pay-per-view in general in the United States because they wanted to. There are certain people who just won't subscribe to DAZN and won't use apps. Primarily older people, I suppose. But there are people who are willing to pay somewhere between $60 and $70 as opposed to subscribing to DAZN. So those fights are on pay-per-view as well. So, the fight is going to be on pay-per-view in the U.S. It's a one-fight deal, as I've been led to believe. PBC is obviously trying to sign Canelo Alvarez to a multi-fight agreement, but he's been reluctant to do that so far. So that's where they're at, like a one-fight deal with Fox Sports pay-per-view. And, let's hope it gets there because it's the fight that people want to, I think people would be interested in the Bivol fight, as I said, Ness, but I think this is the fight people want to see in the sense that they want to see Canelo Alvarez attempt to become the fully unified champion at 168, and he would become, because Charlo Castaño resulted in a draw, he could become just the sixth fully unified champion of the full belt era. So it's an interesting fight in that respect.
Absolutely, man. I hope we can get it. Maestro, do you have anything for Keith?
No, I mean, the only question I have for Keith, and thank you for joining us, Keith, is what would your preference be right now as a secondary option for Canelo should he not get the Plant fight?
Well, you're welcome, guys, for me coming on. But I would look, if we're ever going to see the Canelo Triple G third fight, that's what I would prefer to see in September. Supposedly, Triple G would be on board with that. Of course, we're running out of time here for guys to get in full training camps. I don't know how hard Triple G has been training at this point, but he supposedly is willing to fight him on September 18th if that winds up being the case. I think people, there's some waning interest in that fight, of course, because Triple G is 39 years old, and people think he's sort of a faded version of what he once was, and that Canelo would beat him easier in their third fight than he did in their second fight. That, of course, would remain to be seen, but that would probably, from an event standpoint, that's what I would prefer to see in September. But more than anything, maybe just to kind of, for lack of better words, get that out of the way because that has been lingering for so long. But the Bivol fight is a very good fight, so if that were, Plan C and that wound up happening, I wouldn't be opposed to that.
Is Beterbiev off the table? Sorry, Ness. Is Beterbiev off the table? Because I did hear Eddie Hearn drop that name and say that Canelo was interested in that fight.
Eddie Hearn says a lot of things, I guess, guys, that wind up not being true. But I'll say this, that Beterbiev does not have a dance partner for his next fight. He's not going to fight Joe Smith next because those negotiations fell apart with Top Rank. He doesn't have a mandatory due. He might have one with the WBC, and that might wind up being the fight that he takes eventually. But I think Beterbiev is available. I just don't know, is Canelo going to move back up to 75 to fight I'm not saying he's afraid to fight Beterbiev, but he is a huge puncher. He's an older guy, and he has some defensive flaws and everything, but he's a huge puncher, so I'm not sure that he would take that risk just yet, while there are other fights available for him that that he perceives anyway as less dangerous and for which he could make the same amount of money, basically.
Keith, do you believe any of the ticket sale conspiracies for Wilder Fury and the postponement? Obviously, with Fury testing positive and then showing up at exotic car rental places and taking pictures and being in, shown without any face mask, and then Bob saying only one COVID. Where are you with all this? Any belief in the conspiracy this was pushed back to generate more interest?
The only reason I'd say no, guys, is because how much more interest is there going to be in another month and a half? If that were the case, how much more interest would there be in another month and a half than there was 2 weeks ago? You know, and then of course you would have to get everyone on board with this, and everyone kind of spouting the same company line and not saying that something underhanded happened here. And how are you going to get all those people to go along with that? Particularly, how would you get Deontay Wilder to go along with that? Now, maybe you could argue, oh, well, they just didn't tell him, and that's really what happened behind the scenes. Look, I mean, people have a lot of conspiracy theories about a lot of things. I don't really think that that's the case because they've only pushed the fight back 2.5 months. It's not like they're saying, okay, let's revisit it in a half a year or something like that. I mean, they really...
You're saying...
I just think that... I can't hear what you're saying. What?
No, that must have been some interference. Go ahead. You're good.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, I thought someone was talking. Sorry about that.
No, it was just some interference on my co-host. Did you?
No, that's my fault. Sorry about that.
Yeah, go ahead, Keith. Never mind it.
No, that was pretty much the end. Yeah, I don't think that that's the reason, to be honest with you. But I think I think they're going to lose a fair amount of money on this fight whenever it happens, but they're contractually obligated to do it. So I don't think pushing it back 2.5 months is going to make much of a difference.
What about the rumor from Team Wilder indicating that the real reason this was pushed back was because Jared Anderson knocked out Tyson Fury in sparring?
Yeah, I've heard those same rumors, guys. I don't know if there's any validity to it or not, but I have heard the same things. I mean, your guess is as good as mine, basically.
But you've heard the same thing, so that's interesting. I
have, yeah, but we hear a lot of things that are not true as we go along here. But could happen. I mean, could have happened.
So John Fury seems to believe on a Boxing Scene article, it's not yours, it says Boxing Staff, but he seems to believe that Wilder cherry-picked twice and this third one will cost him his career. I guess the first part is, do you believe that can be considered as a cherry pick, even though, the average boxing, or not the average, but the hardcore boxing fan knows what Tyson Fury is?
What do you mean by cherry picked?
Well, I don't mean anything. John Fury seems to believe Wilder cherry picked Tyson twice, but this third time will cost him his career. But I mean, if you want me to read into it, I'm assuming he's saying, Wilder picked my son when my son was out of weight, coming off of a 3-year layoff, fighting 2 nobodies, and he thought he was going to get an easy win, and it didn't work. Both times it didn't work, and this time, we're going to end them.
Yeah, I don't know. The word cherry-picked is kind of an unusual. I kind of see what he's saying, but I don't know how you pick a lineal heavyweight champion of the world. I guess maybe because he felt like he wasn't in shape for the first fight. He's coming off all these personal problems and all that kind of stuff. Maybe the first time I could see that, not the second time. I mean, Tyson Fury picked 2 laughable opponents in between, the Wilder. Well, not Otto Wallin was not laughable because obviously he gave him a tough fight, but Tom Schwarz was a laughable opponent. So I don't know if he cherry picked him the second time, but I don't know. Again, John Fury says a lot of wacky things, right? So I wouldn't put too much stock into it.
Since you used the term wacky things, do you think Leonard Ellerbe was being wacky when he said that Tank could fight in October in a, and I quote, big pay-per-view, unquote, at 147?
I don't see him fighting at 147 pounds. I mean, Tank is a very small guy. You guys, Ness, you're a big dude, right? I mean, what does Gervonta Davis come up to your belly button or whatever? I mean, he's a small dude, so I don't see him. And I'm not tall, and I'm taller than Gervonta Davis, so I don't see him fighting at 147 anytime soon. I thought 140 was a bold move because whatever people think of Mario Barrios, he's a big guy. I mean, I don't know. They didn't reveal what his weight was on fight night, but he was obviously 5 inches taller than Tank. That's a pretty big risk to take when you're Yeah, he's probably a natural 130-pounder. You know, he's fought at lightweight, of course, but I thought that was pretty risky. I don't see him fighting at welterweight. And who would he fight? I mean, I don't see any reasonable opponents for him at welterweight.
I got a name for you, but I need you to do me a favor and just text Ellerby. You know, I know you're in good with him. Just text him and say, hey, is this realistic? So Andre Berto magically appeared at number 10 on the WBA at 147, and he's been out of the ring 4 years, and he's only 5'8". If you're going to pick a welterweight to bring to Atlanta, Andre Berto is that. He knows more celebrities than the rest of these other welterweights, not named Floyd. He's fits the bill to come to Black Hollywood in Atlanta. He's a welterweight. All of a sudden, even though he's 4 years inactive, he's on the WBA rankings. I think they set it up, but I need you to confirm. That's a great story, by the way.
I completely see what you're saying, but I think the real reason that Andre Berto has magically appeared in the WBA rankings is because he's going to fight Yordenis Ugas. So, that's probably what's going to happen.
So you think that's more probable? I know there's been rumors of Keith and Ugas and Sean and Jamal James. You don't believe those possible rumors?
Both possible, of course, but what I've primarily heard is that Berto is going to fight Ugas. That's what I've been hearing. So and of course that would explain how he magically appeared in the rankings, which is absurd because he hasn't fought in so long. But the WBA does a lot of absurd things, particularly things that PBC asks them to do. So, I'm pretty sure that that's the way it's going to go. And I don't know what Tank is going to do in his next fight. I don't think he's going to fight at 140, and I certainly don't think he's going to fight at 147. But are they going to be able to make this Ryan Garcia fight? Supposedly there was interest from Ryan Garcia's side after he beat Luke Campbell. They had some preliminary discussions, and then once the Pacquiao thing popped up, which was never realistic, that was what Garcia and his team focused on, and they kind of went away from talking to Leonard Ellerby and anyone who was involved in that. But I think that is a big fight. I think that Ryan Garcia would take that fight. I also think he would lose, but it would be a big event, and for Tank Davis's career, I think he needs that type of high-profile fight. Now, I would prefer to see him fight Teofimo Lopez, but that is not going to happen next. But so I think if you can make Tank and Ryan Garcia at 135 next, I think that would be the way that they'd go. Certainly, to me, makes more sense than having him move up to 147 pounds, which to me is a weight that he doesn't belong fighting at.
But if they announced, I'm sorry, because I want to get your true feelings. If they announced Berto Tank on pay-per-view back in Atlanta, what would be your headline?
I would say Ness predicted this, I guess, right?
No. I would love that headline to be on Boxing Scene, let me tell you. It would do wonders. But no, honestly, what would be your thoughts? Because he is out of the ring 4 years, but he is a welterweight that was always a puncher. They say the last thing to go is power, and he fits the bill for Atlanta. Do you think that's too, like, he's just been out the ring too much, and I'm giving them a lob ball here? What is that called in softball? I don't know.
Yeah, I think they would take a ton of criticism, even though he'd be moving up yet another weight class. I think they would take a ton of criticism because people perceive Berto as a shot fighter. I think he's 38 or something. He's pretty old at this point. He hasn't fought in such a long time. How do you justify, especially if they tried to sanction it for some sort of title? They've already taken a lot of criticism, and deservedly so, for him fighting for secondary titles, which he did against Mario Barrios and Yuriorkis Gamboa. You're going to call him a 4-division champion now for fighting Andre Berto. I think it would be a public relations disaster for them to do that, and hopefully they're not going to do that. They're going to go in a different direction. But I don't see how even they could perceive that as a smart thing to do.
Wow, you hate it then. I actually like it. I actually like it. I think Berto has some legitimate power. The last thing to go on a fighter is power. Tank's never been in with a real puncher. So, yeah, maybe he beats Berto up because he's been out the ring 4 years, but we see him get dropped at the very least. I mean, Berto has legitimate power. The fact that he's fought Mayweather, they can sell it like the protege moving up to, the mentor's weight class to take on a common opponent. I don't know. Maybe I'm reaching. I don't know. You know what it is? I went to the Atlanta fight, and Lord, I believe he's a star. I mean, the way he brought those people out, he's a star in my opinion. And I think if he could sell out Atlanta with Barrios, shit, those tickets will double with Berto, I think. But I'm wrong. Maestro, you got anything for Keith?
Well,
Keith, sorry,
Ness,
Keith,
you're not.
go ahead.
Okay.
Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, Ness, you're not wrong at all about saying that he's a star. There are no two ways about that. He is a star. I mean, he might be the biggest box office draw among American fighters. I mean, Canelo obviously is a bigger draw, but among Americans, there's not a bigger draw than Gervonta Davis. He's done it in multiple cities. He did it in his hometown of Baltimore. He's done it twice in Atlanta. He drew the biggest crowd in the history of what used to be known as StubHub Center. He's a star. I mean, but at a certain point, you're really Ellerby made a good point after he beat Barrios. Most of the people there had never heard of Mario Barrios before that fight was made, and they didn't really care who Tank was fighting. They want to go to a Tank fight because that's the event that they're interested in, and they want to see Tank knock the crap out of someone, which is what they eventually saw on June 26th. So to some degree, you're right. It might not matter as much with Tank who he fights as it does with other fighters.
Yeah, Keith, so you brought up the PBC, their relationship with the WBA kind of being tight. I've always kind of felt that as an observer. I've also felt that the WBO has been like closer to Top Rank and Frank Warren, Queensberry out in the UK, which is why I was really baffled by the decision not to reinstate Manny Pacquiao as champion after, the fact that they put him in as champion in recess, which I also found baffling considering how long Keith Thurman was out of the ring and he kept his title, and the fact that obviously they put him in recess when pretty much we're in the middle of a pandemic with COVID-19. So, I mean, what were your thoughts on Pacquiao not being reinstated, and like, what do you think is the explanation for that?
I'm baffled by it too, because primarily these sanctioning organizations do whatever is going to line their pockets more. And what would line their pockets more than Manny Pacquiao fighting Errol Spence in a unification fight? They're certainly not going to make nearly as much money when your Dennis Ugas fights. So I was surprised by it too. And good luck getting a straight answer from the WBA about anything, but it was very surprising because, as you said, the WBA tends to do whatever PBC asks them to do, just like the WBO tends to do with Top Rank. So it was very surprising. But the thing is, guys, I know you guys share this opinion as hardcore boxing guys. We don't care which titles are at stake. I mean, and for the most part, I don't think fans care that much, but the fighters do. And that's the thing that the fighters care about the belts. You see the way, even though it costs them way too much money for sanctioning fees, these belts mean something to almost every fighter. I mean, you see the way that they carry the belts around with pride, and they do mean so. They're not trinkets to these guys. So I guess but the point is Manny Pacquiao, Errol Spence, any lesser of a fight because the WBA super title is not at stake? Who cares? It's a great fight. It's the most intriguing fight, maybe other than Fury Wilder on the boxing calendar now, and that's probably arguable. And I always say this, and I know you guys are on board with it, but who cares which titles are at stake? If Spence and Pacquiao fought for 0 titles, is it a lesser fight? I mean, you wouldn't be able to call it a welterweight title fight, but it's certainly not a lesser event.
No, I agree with you on that one for sure. It's just that we always want one face, one name, one champion in a division, right? And if we could get closer to an undisputed at 147, that would be something that would lead to some clarity for boxing fans. But yeah, I agree with you 100%.
I agree with the both of you guys. I think that we really don't care, but the fact that politics showed its ugly face in this situation, which would have aligned us to all just be pointing at Crawford had they just reinstated him or not stripped him, then it'd just be Crawford. But now we got Ugas still out there, kind of ruining undisputed, so to speak. But I want to go back to my superstar, man, the dude that really moves the needle. And I want to ask, do you really believe that Jojo Diaz is realistic for Tank? as I guess it was Coppinger, I think they reported. I'm not sure. Maybe it was you first. Oh, I don't know. But allegedly, Jojo Diaz is being considered by Ellerby for a Tank. Do you believe?
I could see it in the sense that Jojo Diaz is, probably more of he's closer to a featherweight than a lightweight, but he looked very good in this fight against Javier Fortuna. Deserves a big opportunity after kind of screwing up before his previous fight against Rakhimov when he didn't make weight. It's an interesting fight. I don't think they would draw as much criticism for that as they would if he were to fight Berto. It's not the lightweight that people want to see him. It's not the lightweight that people want to see him fight most, but it's a real fight. I mean, Jojo Diaz his loss to Gary Russell. The first half of that fight was competitive, and Gary Russell is the longest reigning champion in boxing, is an elite level fighter, so there's no shame in losing to him. He's beaten Tevin Farmer, he's beaten Javier Fortuna, he's got some good wins on his record. So yeah, that's an interesting fight, and I think that would be something that they would be seriously looking at.
Keith, have you ever text Ellerby or talked to him like, why isn't the Gary Russell fight an option? Like, that just seems to be such a big fight in the DMV or Atlanta for Tank. Why do you think they don't do it? I mean, you got this guy basically out here. Gary looks like David Benavidez to Charlo, but it's him to Gervonta. I mean, the disrespect that he shows in interviews for Gervonta. When are they going to settle that beef? Do you ever see it happening? And have you spoken to, I guess, Mayweather Promotions ever about the possibility of that fight?
I have spoken to him about the possibility of the fight. I wouldn't say I ever got a satisfying answer or a straight answer as to why it won't happen. They just basically continue to say, we're going to do what we're going to do, and we're going to fight who we're going to fight. Never given a real answer as to, because clearly that's a huge fight in the Washington, D.C., Baltimore area. Exactly. I mean, they would sell out that, whatever the name of the arena, Royal Farms Arena, I think it's called, in Baltimore, or even the Verizon Center in Washington, D.C. I don't know if they would do it in D.C. because that would be perceived as like a home fight for Russell, even though Davis is the star. But the point is, that's a really, really intriguing fight. They would make, I think if they were to do it, which I don't think that they're going to, but if they were to do it, they would do it at lightweight to give Tank a little bit more of an advantage because, of course, Gary Russell's been a featherweight his whole career. But people would be really interested in that fight. I mean, Gary Russell he's not fought in a very long time again. It's been almost a year and a half since he fought Tug Nyambayar. And there's nothing on the schedule or on the horizon for Gary Russell. He's being very vocal about fighting Tank, which I understand. He's going to say the most outlandish things possible, the most offensive things possible to try to lure Tank into that fight. I'm not saying that they're scared to do it, but they do realize how skilled of a guy Gary Russell is, even though he's much smaller than Tank. And he's at the back end of his physical prime, but he's still in his prime. So if I had to guess, even though that's the fight maybe I would want to see, I don't know if I'd want to see it more than Lopez Davis, but it's certainly a fight in the top three that you would want to see, but I don't think it's going to happen.
Wow. So I think the biggest fight for Tank in Atlanta, obviously they can go to Vegas with this one. I don't think they would, because Haney is kind of from Vegas, just did very well in Vegas. I'm sure you know how well. I mean, it looked good from, being there with Linares. Looked very filled. People looked excited. Beautiful crowd came out. I seen tons of Lamborghinis. Do you think Haney Tank is the biggest fight to make in Atlanta? And do you ever see that fight happening? I thought we were a step closer because Haney showed vulnerability with Linares, who's so much older than Tank, landing that shot, causing Haney to be defensive for maybe the last 2 or 3 rounds. Do you think that enticed the Leonard Ellerbys and Mayweather Promotions of the world? Is it time to make that fight?
Well, I'd love to see that fight also, but I do think from an event standpoint, Ryan Garcia, Tank Davis is a bigger event just because of Garcia's fan base, his crossover appeal. I mean, and Tank obviously is a huge star too. So I think those two together would make the bigger event. I don't think Haney is as big a star as Ryan Garcia. You obviously could argue that he's a better fighter, but but in terms of him being a bigger draw and anything, he's not. I was at the Devin Haney Linares fight. The crowd was fine, but I mean, they never gave us an official attendance, but it was probably somewhere between 4,000 and 5,000. It really wasn't that big of a crowd, and the arena holds about 12,000. So it was maybe somewhere close to. If it was 5, it's close to half full, basically. Which on Memorial Day weekend in Vegas, not a terrible crowd, I guess, but I'd love to see that fight too. I mean, in order, I would like to see Lopez, maybe Russell, then Garcia, then Haney. But any of those 4 fights, I think, would satisfy fans. People would want to see any of those fights.
And since we're talking Haney, obviously JoJo won the interim title, and instead of calling out Haney, he says, I want Ryan, but then him and Haney get into a back and forth, and they verbally agreed in November. Have you spoken to any bigwigs about the interest in really putting that down on a DAZN schedule?
Which fight is that, Ness?
Devin Haney versus JoJo Diaz, since he's the interim, and they got into a back and forth on Twitter, and they both agreed to fight in November.
Okay. Yeah, I don't. He is the interim champion, but that has not led so far, and this is not Haney's fault because Haney wanted to fight Garcia. I think Haney's going to push to fight Garcia. Well, I don't think Garcia is going to fight him, but I think Haney's going to want. And I'm not saying that JoJo Diaz hasn't earned the opportunity by beating Fortuna. He did. But I think Haney is going to want a higher profile fight because the Diaz fight is a risky fight, but not nearly as high profile as the other fights. So if I'm him, I would want to be paid for what might be a more dangerous fight, but a bigger fight.
Mm-hmm.
But it is makeable from the DAZN standpoint, as you said.
Again, I'm just hoping that some of these... some of these conversations can fall in the ears of the right person. Maybe you do some text like to an Espinoza. Right now, Devin Haney is a free agent. It sounds like a 3-fight deal makes sense over there. You could do Javier Fortuna, Rolly, and Tank. Showtime. Sounds worth it.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Even Gary Russell. You can take out Fortuna. Gary Russell wanted all the Devin Haney smoke when he was with DAZN, and Bill was trying to make that a lot, whether or not it was propaganda and hype to build up the Linares fight. It worked. Gamboa fight, it worked, and we still want it. I would love to see Haney, Gary Russell. I know most would think he would be outsized, but, he beat JoJo, and look at what JoJo did to a 135-pounder, No,
that's a good point, Ness, and I think... Haney, I just would like to see how careful they're going to be about his matchmaking at this point after what happened against Linares because, that was kind of a career-altering 10th round there where he showed some vulnerability. And, of course, it's boxing. Everyone's going to get hurt at some point for the most part, get knocked down or whatever. He didn't get knocked down. But, that's boxing, so to speak. But I just wonder how that's going to impact their matchmaking strategy moving forward.
I mean, but wouldn't it make sense to try and make the Gary Russell fight as he's a 126-pounder, going to have to move up to fight Haney?
Yeah, he's a smaller guy, someone who you would perceive at least to be less dangerous than the punchers at lightweight. But like everything else, it's going to come down to money. I mean, is there enough money in a Gary Russell fight to satisfy Devin Haney to take what would still be a risk against a smaller guy?
Wow, you don't think there's money in a Gary Russell Haney? We could do that in the DMV.
Not nearly as not.
I think that it's a bigger
not
fight.
Not nearly as much as if he fought Ryan Garcia or certainly if he fought Tank or Teofimo Lopez. I think there's more money in those fights.
Keith, we got to dive into this a little more. Do you still have time? I don't want to keep you. I know you're not going to be rude.
Yeah, I'm good for a few more. Yeah.
Okay, we got to dive into this more. I need to know, why do you believe Ryan's a star? Like, didn't he only sell 6,000 tickets or 7,000? Like, hasn't he only been a main event once? Or am I missing something?
Well, remember when his fight, and I'm not, the biggest Ryan Garcia advocate or anything. I think that when he fights these top lightweights, he's going to lose. But they sold a decent amount of tickets in what was still kind of the heart of the pandemic. You know, there were still a lot of restrictions on people in Dallas when he fought, you know, right after New Year's Day in Dallas, which was really, the fight was in Dallas primarily because it was one of the only places that you could take a fight and have a crowd. The fight had no business being in Dallas because Ryan Garcia has no attachment to Dallas. He's fighting a British opponent. I mean, it made no sense for it to be there other than that's where you could go with it. If Ryan Garcia would have fought Linares, which of course was the fight they were hoping to do last July before the pandemic happened, I think they would have drawn a sizable crowd in Southern California because they drew a pretty decent crowd on Valentine's night at the Honda Center in Anaheim. They drew a crowd, but you know, but I still think Tank is a bigger draw, a bigger star. You know, I think he's proven that at the box office. So. And we don't see, you know, the other thing to keep in mind, guys, is we don't know what the viewership numbers are on DAZN because those numbers are not available to us, and DAZN does not release them. Nielsen doesn't track the numbers, so you have no idea how many, you know, people tend to take shots at Showtime's ratings or whatever, but you don't even know, or we don't even know how many people are watching on DAZN. I mean, you might get an idea from the inside on occasion, but you don't know how many people are watching the fight. So less people are probably watching his fights than are watching the other guy's fights, so that's a factor also.
You do know, though, Keith, that he did do well on that Valentine's Day card at the, I forget what it's called, but the arena in Anaheim against the Nicaraguan Fonseca, right?
The Honda Center, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
no, he did very well. I think it was almost 10,000, I think, which is a very good crowd, you know, especially among Americans. I mean, which Americans sell 9,000, 10,000 tickets? It just doesn't happen that often.
So, Keith, do you think that interests Espinoza? Would that interest him? Like Haney, Russell, Haney, Rolando Romero, which then sets up a credible but still not so dangerous opponent for Tank, right? Or do you think Haney's dangerous? Damn. Sorry about that. Do you think that Haney is dangerous for a Tank and they won't do that?
No, I don't think that they won't do it. Of course, you would have to lock Haney into a long-term deal, as you mentioned earlier, Ness, maybe a 3-fight deal or something. And then, of course, you have the PBC complication. Now, there are fighters who are boxing on Showtime with regularity, primarily Duran Ennis, who are not affiliated with PBC. So I don't think it's imperative that Haney align himself with PBC if he were to come to Showtime in a multi-fight deal. But of course it would interest them. But as with everything else in life, it's going to come down to money because he's not, you know, he's been overpaid for his fights at DAZN. Now, DAZN was in a position where it was overpaying American fighters and others because they were trying to make an impact in American boxing. Now, to some degree they have, but they're not overpaying like they once were. So what is Devin Haney's market value as opposed to what he thinks his market value is? That, I think, is what it would come down to if he were to go to Showtime or to remain at DAZN, because he, assuming, has an inflated opinion of what his market value is, and understandably so to some extent, because he's been paid what he's been paid for the last few fights.
Yeah, absolutely. Can I pivot real quick to the heavyweights, Ness, and ask Keith about that? So, Keith, it's the glamour division. Obviously, right now, we don't have a U.S. title holder with Fury and AJ being the heavyweight champs. But I'm, for one, am very intrigued by this Saturday's fight between Carlos Takam out of France and Joe the Juggernaut Joyce out of London. But we can't watch it on U.S. television. You know, I was expecting it to be on ESPN Plus. It's not on ESPN Plus. One, are you interested in this fight? Two, how will you watch this fight? And three, why isn't ESPN Plus showing this card? Because it is on BT Sport and is a Queensberry Promotions card.
Yeah, I think we're all surprised that ESPN did not pick up the fight, because they have mostly picked up most of Frank Warren's fights. So it is surprising, because Joyce is a puncher and he's a guy people want to see. And of course, they put on a lot lesser fights on ESPN Plus that people don't want to see. So I'm kind of surprised that this will not be available to us. And guys, I mean, there's no real legal way to watch the fight if you live in the U.S. I mean, so, you know, that doesn't mean people won't find a way to watch it, but it's not available to us in the U.S. So it's disappointing, because I think, you know, Takam he's going to bring the fight to him, but he's going to lose, and he's probably going to get knocked out. But it's a real opponent for Joyce after, you know, the biggest win of his career against Daniel Dubois. I mean, it's not a gimme, but he's of course favored to win the fight, and I think he will win. But it's a fight I think we would all like to see, and I agree with you that it's disappointing that it's not available in the U.S.
Absolutely.
Well, Keith, I guess before we let you go, two things. Is Regis lying, or is his fight with Mikey being announced? Because he posted on his Twitter yesterday, Regis Prograis versus Mikey Garcia to be announced. And do you think we get the rematch with Jermell Charlo and Brian Castaño?
I'll take your second question first. I do not think that we get a rematch between Jermell Charlo and Brian Castaño as much as we all want to see it. I do think that the mandatory obligations for those two fighters are going to take them in different directions for the time being. And then, you know, maybe somewhere down the line they revisit it. But I don't see the rematch happening anytime soon. Charlo's IBF mandatory is way overdue. The WBC mandatory against Erickson Lubin is now due, although I don't think they'll make that fight because it's not. I don't think it's a marketable fight, and I don't see that anyone willing to pay the kind of money it would require for that fight to happen again. So I think he might make his IBF mandatory next, and then the WBO probably will order Castaño's his mandatory against Tim Tszyu. Castaño might have to go to Australia for that fight if it winds up going to purse bid or something, but I don't see that fight happening next, and maybe not ever. The rematch between those guys is really good.
Keith, you really think that Al won't pull favor and have the WBC mandatory call rather than go the IBF route to Melikuliev? Or whoever this guy is, Bakaram?
The thing is, it's either that or he's going to have to give up the title. Because at some point, you know, Main Events, which is his promoter, has taken undercard slots on Charlo's last two fights to allow the fights to happen. And that's fine because PBC is paying for the fights. But if Charlo wants to, remember, the IBF is the organization that sticks to its rules, unlike the other three. So they're going to eventually order him to, and why wouldn't Charlo do it? He'll make from what I've seen in his last two fights, Charlo will destroy the IBF mandatory. And if it lasted 4 rounds, I'd be stunned because he's been hurt in each of his last two fights against guys who were not anything resembling Jermell Charlo. Having said that, I don't think the Lubin fight is a fight that can be made because there's no interest in it whatsoever. I think most people, despite Erickson Lubin's really good win against Jason Rosario and the fact that he's 6-0 since he has lost to Charlo, I don't think people perceive that as a tough fight for Charlo. I think they think Charlo will knock him out again because Lubin's chin he doesn't have a reliable chin. I mean, that's putting it mildly, probably. So while it's commendable that he's taken these fights and maybe he'll get another title shot, I don't think it's going to be against Jermell Charlo. So I think the IBF mandatory would be the way that they go maybe next, unless he gives up the title. But like we were saying before, guys, the titles mean a lot to these fighters. So I don't think he's just going to willingly give up one of them instead of taking this mandated fight.
Let's assume.
And I forgot what your other question was.
Oh, yeah, the Mikey and Regis. But you know what? Let's put that on the back burner because let's assume you're right. He goes the IBF route. They don't vacate. Lubin, you say no, there's no interest, so they need to give Lubin a fight. Obviously, Kevin Cunningham is pushing the Danny Garcia fight. Danny interviewed with me in Miami. He said he wanted to move up to 54. He said he needed one fight, and then if they offered him Jermell, he would absolutely take it because he's in this for legacy. Do you think that's possible? Is Danny too small? Does Lubin hit too hard? Would Al really put Lubin-Danny, which then sets up Jermell for his biggest fight because then he can get Danny as a mandatory?
I do think that Garcia, as he said, I think that Garcia is going to fight once at 54 to acclimate himself to the weight class. I don't think it's going to be against Erickson Lubin because that's not an easy fight. So, that seems to me like if his end game is to get to Charlo and try to become a 154-pound champion, I don't think he's going to walk through that fire necessarily to get there. And he probably won't have to, because they'll say, hey, look, he's really a junior welterweight who's fought at welterweight and is moving up to 154. So let's give him a reasonable test at 154 before he tries to fight Jermell Charlo. And I'm not saying he would have earned a shot at Jermell Charlo by beating some, B-, C+ level 54-pounder, but I think that's what's going to happen. I don't see him fighting Eric. I think Erickson Lubin would fight him, but I don't see Garcia taking that type of fight when you have the payday and the opportunity of Charlo dangling in the background.
Now, like you said, you've seen Lubin hurt in his last couple of fights. Harrison just fought a welterweight. Does none of this entice these fighters? Do you think they're thinking, or their handlers are thinking safety first, or is anyone looking at Perella not being Danny, never being a two-time, two-division, 3-division champion? I mean, if Perella could do that to Harrison, I mean, shouldn't Danny at least not be knocked out? And I don't know. I think he should be able to hang with Erickson Lubin, who's never been the world champion.
Yeah, again, I'll just say what I said before. I think it's too much of a risk for him in his 154-pound debut to do it. I don't see because he can fight a lesser guy, and this has been a blueprint in PBC before. He can fight a lesser guy to get to the Charlo fight, if again, that's what they want. And I have been led to believe that is what they want. They want Charlo to fight Danny Garcia. Like, I fully expect Charlo to fight Danny Garcia before he fights Castaño again, if ever.
Get the fuck out of here. Seriously? That's amazing. How long have you been expecting that? Was it before? I mean, oh, man, wow, that's crazy. Danny's lucky. And he's got to be confident.
Yeah, well, hey, look, and Danny has been he's fought everyone. If this is the route he's going to go, move up to 154 and get a payday out of it, whether anyone thinks it's a fight that he can win or not, he's earned that to some extent, right? I mean, he's fought everybody, and he's lost 3 times, but all against top-level guys, and he's been there in welterweight title unification fights. So I think he's earned that to a certain degree.
Damn. I mean, I think Charlo's too active for Danny, but hey, Keith, man, I don't want to keep you any longer.
Oh, I don't think he'll, and that's to be clear, I don't think he'll win.
Yeah.
But I think the fight will eventually happen.
Yeah, and Charlo took some decent. I mean, I felt like, I know people think he got hurt, but the way that he reacted to those punches was to punch back, where Castano reacted like, okay, let me back up and get my thoughts together, or let me clinch. So I don't know that he could be hurt. Like, I know people considered that hurt. I didn't really. I'm looking at this dude. On one of those replays, he bit down on the mouthpiece after Castano hit him, and then just fired a 1-2 down the pipe. That dude, I can't believe it.
He was hurt. He was hurt in the 3rd round. He fell back into the ropes. It could have been called a knockdown, in my opinion.
You're saying when he squatted, right?
Yeah.
Bro, did you see how he sprung back up?
Had that happened, I've seen guys get knocked down and get right back up. That's a fighter's instinct right there.
But see, he never touched the canvas. He looked more like Lubin in the Jorge Colta fight, where he dropped down and I don't know.
Having settled this all between me and Nesk, what could that have been called a knockdown? Yes or no? I'll concede depending on what you say.
Go ahead, Keith. He wants you to be the tiebreaker.
That's a questionable one. It's obviously at the referee's discretion there. I don't know. It happened very quickly, and I did watch it several times on the replay. And since I've come home from San Antonio, I watched it again. He kind of, I don't know if you could argue that the ropes held him up, and that's generally the rule. If the ropes hold up a fighter, if he otherwise would have gone down, I don't know that you could make that. You probably could make that argument, but I think it's debatable, and it happened so fast in the heat of the moment. I don't think the referee ever considered that. And I will say what Ness said makes sense, and he was really he was firing back bombs 2 seconds later. So I don't know. When I wrote the story live at ringside, I didn't use the word hurt, and I did that intentionally. I think I used the word, he was affected by the punch because his legs buckled, and he went into the ropes, of course. But I don't know that he was hurt. I would say that that's the most I've ever seen, that I can remember, that I've ever seen Jermell Charlo impacted by a punch because he like you said, he
I
went
love
into the
your
ropes
vocabulary.
and legs buckled and all.
You're choosing all the right words, Keith. You have the. I mean, it shows that you're a writer. How long have you been?
Right here.
How long have you been covering the sport?
Since the end of 1996, basically.
Wow.
So
Congratulations.
That just means I'm old. I'm old, I guess.
Nah. It means
middle school.
It means you're knowledgeable, man. Congratulations. and where could everyone find your work?
I appreciate the kind words, Ness. They can find me at boxingscene.com. We're constantly updating on the site every day, and my Twitter handle is just my last name. It's at Idec, IDEC Boxing.
Keith, can you confirm or deny if that site does 27 million hits a day? Is that true? I heard a rumor.
No, about 27 million seems like a lot, but
I know it does. It
but
does.
we do. It's the most trafficked boxing website on the internet, which is obviously
the world.
Good for all of us. You know, we try to
Absolutely.
crank out the content, and it's a grind every day, obviously, but well worth it in many respects. And we appreciate you guys reading. We appreciate the kind words, man.
Any books? Have you written any books or have any books coming out? Anything you're working on other than your day-to-day articles?
No, I've tried to write books in the past. I was a newspaper writer for 23 years, and that one thing I'll say, I have an agent and everything, and I've tried to write one boxing book and a book on an NFL player, and it's just very difficult unless it's like some salacious thing or a superstar type of fighter or football player or whatever to get an advance for a book, and it's really so time consuming that I'd almost have to take a break from some sort of sabbatical to really devote the amount of time to it that is really required, and I can't do this is not the kind of job that you take a step back from for a few months to work on a book. So as much as I would like to do it at this point right now, again, I found out the hard way that getting an advance for a book, especially at a time where less people are reading books, is very difficult.
Yeah, man, maybe a digital book. I think that, I don't know if I'm sure you know Adrian Clark. I mean, that book, Dark Horse, just his experiences being told kind of like it's like backroom meetings. Like, I thought that book was phenomenal. I could imagine the stories that you must have with all these fighters that we don't know. Little things like him saying that he was trying to broker that Earl Cotto deal, all those little things that we didn't know. That, like, I don't know. Maybe you should think about it. I would buy it and support it and promote it right here. Think digital, too, because you're right. People aren't really buying hardcovers, even though I got a hardcover of Dark Horse and supported Adrian because it's a phenomenal book. But, yeah, man, I would buy it, bro. I would buy it. And if it's great, I would do a live read like I did his and express that to my audience to pick it up.
I appreciate the love, Ness. I want to check out Adrian's book too, so I appreciate the tip on that as well. And who knows, who knows what position we'll all be in a couple of years or whatever,
For sure. Well, Keith, man, thank you again. If you want to give out your social media, do so, and we really, really appreciate your time.
Thanks again, guys. Yeah, it's just at Idec Boxing on Twitter, and obviously on the website we're updating it, multiple times every day, every hour actually. So.
All right. Well, thank you so much.
Keith. Really appreciate it.
There you have it, Keith
Idec
of Boxing Scene.
Yo, if you enjoyed the video, feel free to hit the like, subscribe, and share. As always, if you want to support us to the next level, head over to the patreon.com/ThaBoxingVoice. We have tons of exclusive from Border Wars, Entitled, betting shows, the list goes on and on and on. But in addition to that, if you guys have questions for fighters, trainers, and promoters, this is where you can submit them. We will run out, get these questions answered, and put it back on the show just for you guys. Appreciate it. Peace.